Once upon a time, in the quaint town of Willowbrook, there stood a charming little cottage with a bright red door and a garden bursting with colorful flowers. This cottage belonged to Mrs. Jenkins, a sweet elderly widow who had decided it was time to downsize and move closer to her grandchildren. Excited to start this new chapter of her life, Mrs. Jenkins enlisted the help of Mr. Smith, the locale real estate agent known for his friendly smile and trustworthy advice. "Mr. Smith, I want to sell my home quickly so I can be closer to my grandbabies," Mrs. Jenkins said, her eyes twinkling with anticipation. "Of course, Mrs. Jenkins. Let's get started right away," Mr. Smith replied enthusiastically. Together, they walked through the cottage, discussing its charming features and unique quirks. As they sat down to talk about pricing, Mrs. Jenkins expressed her fondness for her home and her desire to get the most out of its sale. "I understand, Mrs. Jenkins, but we must be realistic about pricing," Mr. Smith explained gently. "We want to attract as many potential buyers as possible, and overpricing could scare them away." Mrs. Jenkins hesitated, but ultimately trusted Mr. Smith's expertise and agreed to list the cottage at a reasonable price. Weeks went by, and although there was plenty of interest in the cottage, no offers came in. Mrs. Jenkins grew frustrated and worried that she would never be able to move closer to her grandchildren. One day, Mr. Smith came to visit with news that would change everything. He showed Mrs. Jenkins a list of comparable homes in the area that had sold quickly and for a fair price. "I think we may have overpriced the cottage, Mrs. Jenkins," Mr. Smith admitted. "But don't worry, we can adjust the price and attract more buyers." With Mr. Smith's guidance, they lowered the price of the cottage, and within days, they received multiple offers. Mrs. Jenkins was overjoyed and soon found herself packing her bags and moving closer to her beloved grandchildren. And so, Mrs. Jenkins learned that in the world of real estate, the right price can make all the difference between a house that sits on the market and one that sells quickly and smoothly.